Greetings from Moab, Utah, everybody. I'm just thrilled to be able to participate in this meeting and to think about the crown. I was on the faculty at the University of Montana for about 23 years before, venturing out on some sojourns that have left me here, found me here in Moab at Utah State University. And I just think it's great that the forum is addressing recreation. It's something that I studied in that region for a long time, and I think it's very timely that you're doing it. And I think the Crown is particularly well suited to meet the challenges that are coming your way, without a doubt. So I'm going to talk about a few kind of big macro trends, drilling a little bit into the Flathead area. I am not an expert on the dynamics of Canada and decided that rather than take the risk of making an idiot out of myself, that I'm going to focus on the data that I understand better. So I'm going to look at things that have kind of a US orientation, but I think that the people in this group will be able to help contextualize it to where it needs to go. And we're going to look at three basic kind of trends that are happening. One is that we're going to see, I think, continued popularity, and that not only will we have more people, that these are going to be different kinds of people seeking different kinds of things. And the way we're managing visitors is also seemingly turning a corner right now. And so those three things are going to converge here in this talk. Let's see if before I get going on the trends, which is what I was asked to talk about, I want to just give a little context. A few years ago, for the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act, my dear colleague Steve McCool and I were asked to do some thinking about what the future of wilderness was going to be. And the context for that ask, I think, was that a lot of wilderness managers at the time were concerned that maybe socially wilderness had lost a little of its pizzazz, and that particularly with younger people, that they were abandoning the idea of wilderness for Game Boys and in rooms with electrical outlets and that sort of thing. So we got to thinking about change and how systems change, and how all good ideas are continuing to evolve, and how society is changing, and decided that this infinity curve, or the adaptive cycle that Hollings and others put together in 2001, helped describe our systems pretty well. And so the idea here is that, and I'll apply it to sort of the national park movement in the US, and we came out of the post-World War II era with a great consolidation of opinion about the love of our parks, and we had high value for these parks, and people were really connected in agreement about these values. And that became kind of the status quo for a long time, decades really, and our infrastructure followed that interest. So when we think about Mission 66 and now finally getting some infrastructure money to replace that stuff, that's how we built out our park. And we were in that conservation mode for quite a while. But as we look around today, we see a lot of rapid changes happening. And those changes, lead to sort of a release of that opinion. And what more importantly, they're going to lead to is sort of a rethink of what our protected areas are, what their purpose is, who's using them, why they're using them, all of that sort of stuff. So I think that's where we are. We're seeing massive changes in our society, and that's leading to a bit of this rethink. And as important as doing it, it's who's doing it. And right now, the greatest generation developed, brought the boomers out here to gain this kind of conservation that we've been in for a long time. But now we're going to be hearing the voices of millennials that are going to largely be defining the next management era of our conservation areas generally. And that's going to be a different voice, and they're probably going to come up with a new normal. because they're going to do it in a very different context than what we've had before. So that has framed this idea of seeking a new normal has framed a lot of my thinking, putting these thoughts together for today. Okay, so that leads to kind of the first trend I want to talk about and unpack a little bit, but that we're going to have more visitors joining a larger local population and supporting a larger economic base. And all of those together are going to exert continued pressure on the primary attractions. In this case, it's the crown, the core of the crown, Glacier Waterton, and then all of the landscape around it. So let's unpack that a little bit. Get this thing to work. So Dana mentioned, I think, that your first meeting was in 2001. So if you look at that last 20 years and just the sheer visitation to Glacier National Park, and let's use that as sort of a proxy of what's happening in the region, you know, we've almost doubled. We went from 1.6 million people visiting the park annually in 2001 to about 3.3 million in 2016, 17 in that era. And now we saw a big drop off as a result of COVID in 2020, but that's bouncing back. And all indications nationally are, unless we end up with some serious changes to gasoline prices and airfares and some of that as a result of sort of geopolitics happening right now. But all indications are that this coming summer is going to be higher than ever. And it's important, I think, to appreciate that this era here, as busy as it's been, was largely domestic visitation. We were not experiencing much international visitation. So we've kind of broke even with our trend, even taking the international visitors out of the formula. And certainly they're going to return in probably 3 to 5 years. So we have you know, a steady trend of growth that we've been grappling with that you talked about for a long time. We've also seen during COVID a real renaissance in outdoor recreation. And it's not necessarily the I want to go to the park, you know, driving this as much as I need to go outside. And we're starting to see people amass the resources that they need to do that. So this is just looking at expenditures on some of the key outdoor recreation gear. I mean, we all know you couldn't find a mountain bike or an e-bike, you know, if you wanted one over the last couple of years, and RV sales were backed up. So we know that, you know, set of outfitted people is on the way. But when you just think about the little things that people are buying, you know, stand-up paddle boards are up 82% in 2020, camp chairs and kayaks, you know, up 28-30%. Backpacking tents, dehydrated food up 62%. So we have kind of re-outfitted ourselves as a society, and I think that we're going to want to go use those toys. And so if you're thinking that there's a lot of stand-up paddle boards or kayaks out on Lake McDonald right now, when you look out there, I would anticipate you're going to see quite a few more of them coming. So people are going to want to use their new toys. And then they're going to meet a lot more locals. So, you know, the trend for demographics in the United States, at least, is urbanization. I mean, we have a net loss of non-metro population in the US over the last 10 years. But Montana grew by 10% between 2010 and 2020, which gave it the, you know, you're still trying to keep up with Utah here, but the 4th largest proportional rural growth in the US. And then within that, Flathead County grew by 15%, Kalispell by 23%, Whitefish by 22%. So that's starting to add up, where this amenity migration is getting real in that area. So there's more local people, and they are going to want to be using the resources a little bit differently than the visiting folks. Finally, you know, the industry that's preparing for this, the airport, you know, added 100,000 seats over 2019 and 2021. They're planning continued expansion. So I think we can anticipate that There's more people to receive more people, and the economy is getting increasingly interlinked with that tourism. If you just look at how visitors have been to national parks, have been spending money in Montana over the last decade, that has increased considerably from 400 million in 2012 to 640 million in 2019. Of course, then we saw a drop off in 2020. And these are just the Montana national parks, and Glacier Park is responsible for about 2/3 of this spending. So I think they were 290 million in 2020. So we have more people coming, more people living there, and more industry and livelihood connected to it. So I don't see anything that is going to suggest that those trends are going to substantially change. Okay. The second trend is that I think that we're going to be socially defining protected areas differently. We're in a new area of transportation, communication, and lifestyle choice, and that is going to have an influence on the way we, what we want from our protected areas and how we think they should be managed. So let's unpack that a little bit. First of all, we have a generational change that we've talked about for many years, but it's becoming real. So we got the boomer generation, which is still retiring about 10,000 people a day in the United States, that is going to continue doing that until the last ones are 65, and that's in about 6 years. So that is going to frame a lot of people. And baby boomers are, they have a relatively, as a generation, high level of wealth. They're healthier, they live longer, they're more active. 70 is the new 50. You have a lot of those kinds of things going on with the boomers. And so we're seeing an awful lot of them with this newfound freedom to rejoin our parks. And then millennials are a larger cohort of people in the US. And while there's a lot made about the differences between these generations, they really have most things in common. But there are some distinctions. So the millennials, or the Gen Y crowd, really are consistently more health and diet conscious than their previous generations. They are more sustainability oriented, and they apply that sustainability mentality toward the consumer support they provide. They are consistently concerned about social and environmental justice. And I see that not only, in the people that I interact with out in parks, but working in a university, it is very impressive to see the way the junior faculty or younger faculty members fit into this kind of a mold now, and how very important that is. There is a unified interest in climate change and concern about it, and that this group is a little less loyal to institutions than previous generations. They're not as likely to spend their whole career at a certain place, or become as loyal to a brand and that sort of thing as other generations have been, and for good reason. I mean, they've gone through a couple of financial crises. So they've got a lot of student loan debt and more difficulty getting mortgages and all of that sort of stuff. So you can see as a generation why they might be a little skeptical of these institutions that we're supposed to be providing an improved life for them. So if we think about these generational pressures on outdoor recreation, and if we plot that against growth in national park visitation in the US, we can see where the baby boomers were born and where the millennials are born. So the baby boomers are, and their parents were responsible for that massive, growth that we had after World War II. And now the millennials and the boomers together, along with Gen X, and I don't mean to leave you guys out like everybody else does, but the size of these groups is huge. So they're converging now with these cohorts to supply demand for our protected areas. And we can anticipate that that's going to continue to grow. They're also choosing lifestyles that are more mobile. So the millennials and Gen X crowd are becoming more mobile, old enough to have a little more discretionary money and time, and they're also more likely than previous generations to seek a lifestyle. So we're seeing things certainly down here in Utah. The van life crowd is a real deal. I mean, there's a lot of people that are choosing to live their life with a little more freedom, and our ability to work from home is really or remotely is really exacerbating some of that. So lots of people, but they're a little bit different. And the other thing that we can note here is that it is the millennials that are going to be making many of the management calls, because they're really kind of getting into that workforce now as we move forward. And if they have different ideals, that's what's going to get executed. Okay, another thing about this lifestyle is that we really do have a transportation and communication revolution happening. And General Motors sells more vehicles in Europe than they do in the United States. And so it's no mystery that they're going to electric vehicles at the pace that they're going, because Europe is demanding it. And so we are all connected into this global kind of position, and we want more clean, green machines. We want more electric vehicle transport, and that includes mass transit and just sustainable movements. But it's not just that. That's what gets, Tesla and that get all of the kind of buzz. But if you look at how large systems are working, like say the UCLA campus, which is 75,000 students, and is a good kind of, I think, indicator of what people are getting used to. They have built that campus around the notion of micromobility. So you can move across this enormous space with a series of bicycles, electric scooters, sustainable mass transit systems that make that all possible for the students to cover large territory. And this is what people are getting used to and will be expecting in even places as remote as the Crown when they come to visit. Autonomous vehicles are becoming a reality. I know there's certainly issues with safety and it hasn't rolled out as fast. But I was in my hometown of Rochester, Minnesota last summer, and they have an autonomous bus that's just running around town that doesn't have a driver, and people are riding it all the time. So I think we're going to start seeing different ways that the transport industry is changing. And I can't think of another industry more tied to the internal combustion engine than tourism, or a institution more designed for vehicles than national parks. So if you think about how close they are tied, these are going to have effects on what we manage. The other thing is that machines talk to each other. If you think about how Apple does Find My Phone, if somebody steals it, they just Bluetooth when you pass by each other. Well, cars can do that too. And so it's very likely that eventually our cars are going to know whether the Logan Pass parking lot is full far before we do. And we just have to decide whether or not we want to ask them. Okay, then there's other things like air traffic that are really going to change. Air taxis are now being sold. The companies are public on the New York Stock Exchange. They're just waiting for FAA approval, but they're quiet and they can move 150 miles on a battery charge, and that they are going to start affecting the way people want to use our parks also. Okay, then just quickly on communication, this isn't going to be a big surprise to anybody, but this is a study we did in Bryce Canyon this year, and we asked folks if they had a mobile device. Yes, everybody did. And then how did you use it? And 80% of the people sent or received a text while they were in Bryce Canyon. Over 75% used it for GPS navigation. And so this is just becoming an integral part of the way we interact with the world. And this notion of connectivity is going to define us quite a bit. So there's some questions. Are we going to have the infrastructure to accommodate this EV delivered tourist? Are we going to have the power, the connectivity, the sustainability? Will we have policies in place to accommodate new demands for transportation types like e-bikes or air taxis? And will we understand and take advantage of the potential of distributed communication tools for visitor management? And, you know, those of us in the conservation world, this is a gross generalization, but we're not always the first ones that want to jump on understanding, you know, how technology is changing everything. And so we really should be integrating that into our planning. Okay, so our third trend is that management of popular destination parks is increasingly moving towards systems that choreograph the pace and timing of visitation. And we can do that now because we have availability of big data. Our visitors are connected the way they've never been before. But to do it right, we have to look at the whole affected system, and we have to think at the appropriate scale because we're going to be moving people around. So Dr. Manning, Bob Manning, has told us for a decade now that intensive use of recreation areas may require intensive management. If you want to come to Arches, you better get your permit now. It's going to be a timed entry system this year. We saw that at Glacier last year, and again this year. It's happening in several other parks around the country, but we're looking at these high visitation nodes, and it's going to really affect the way people are using an area. Okay. And visitors tend to be fairly comfortable with it, but it is going to change the way people use the place. If you look at September and October for the last 10 years at Glacier, you see almost 100% increase in September. And you do see 100% increase in October. Now, when people can't get a permit or whatever in the summer months, and they have a nice new RV and they have time on their hands, I think we're going to see these shoulder seasons really expand over the next 10 years. Okay, finally, if we're going to think at scale, we need to think like the Crown is doing at a regional kind of perspective. Here's an example being done in Zion that I'm tangentially involved with. And in this case, we have the political class, the public land managers, the business, and some academics all working together to create a regional recreation plan so that when Zion makes a shift in their management, it isn't going to just destroy some other kinds of places. And they have come along to think this is really an all hands on deck way to think about recreation. So there's a big program with working groups that are looking at advertising and trip planning and communication. Others are really trying to understand how to make sure that the visitor experience doesn't turn into something that is just mediocre. We've got a group looking at how visitation is going to disperse through the area to make sure it goes to places that want the visitation rather than those that don't. And then also, how are we going to move people around, and how can that become a positive economic thing rather than viewed as a loss? So it's thinking about intensive management, but then putting it into a regional context. Okay, so let me conclude that our conundrums will continue. We've always had the conserve for enjoyment of current and future generations, and that still holds, but we have to figure out how to do that now and accommodate even more visitation and do it in a more socially just way. So if we're going to put any kind of access mediation into the system, how do we make sure we do that fairly and that it isn't just featuring the people that can plan ahead and afford it and all that sort of stuff? Our infrastructure is going to need to increasingly be more inviting to the sustainably driven consumers. I think the millennial crowd is going to want that. And access to public lands is going to be increasingly reevaluated. So how do we keep these places special without making them exclusive or too expensive? How do we become welcoming to a full range of our population? How do we regulate access to primary destinations without destroying the surrounding areas? And how do we accept a reservation-based future without losing the opportunity to spontaneously and impulsively get lost? So it seems to me that you have an outstanding agenda to ponder those questions and others here this week. And I hope that this is the beginning of a good regional conversation about some of this stuff. With that, I say thank you.
Thank you very much, Wayne. That was fabulous. I would like to just offer, before we transition to our panel, I would maybe just like to take one or two questions. I hope we can squeeze in for time here. So if someone has a question, can you please, for Wayne, can you please raise your hand, and Natalie and Holly can help me find the hands that go up. I can see them. You can also put a question in the chat if you prefer that as well.
I see Mike Munoz has his hand up.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Mike, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So Wayne, just a quick question on making places more accessible and just to help people with the way that they're living in their urban settings, for example. Do you see any differences between wilderness versus a national park? Because those are vastly two different areas.
Thanks, Mike. I think that's a great question. And I think it's one of the reasons that we really need to start thinking regionally now before, and so that these different values can clearly be articulated in context with one another, So, the Great Bear Wilderness is certainly very different than Glacier National Park in a lot of ways, with mandates and everything else. But if you reduce access or hold access the same in Glacier over time, and demand for the region continues to grow, that's going to spill somewhere. And so we may start to see the way our wildernesses are perceived and used differently. And that'll probably manifest with policy proposals like, hey, we ought to be able to mountain bike in this part of the wilderness, and we ought to be able to, because the generation that's coming up may not view some of those kind of parameters of wilderness the same as people did in the 60s when it was all designed and maintained. So yes, I see it different, and I do think there's still a great demand for wilderness and these primitive and wild experiences, but I think they're going to be harder and harder to get as we continue to be connected.